Hi, welcome back to another episode on the Healthy Wisdom series with Dr. Jen Chen. All right, Healthy Wisdomers, today we're going to cover the number 8 guiding principle of good governance and how it applies to our daily lives. So the principle of transparency is one of the key areas that I think will help you clarify and be more in alignment with you in your life. This is the definition. The board ensures that principals and where relevant other stakeholders are able to see clearly the governance model as well as the business model and ultimately the performance of the organization. Let's break this down a little bit further. So when the board ensures that principals and where relevant to other stakeholders, so we're talking about, for example, in you and your family structure, you as parents or you as grandparents, and your relevant other stakeholders, as is your children or your siblings, are able to see clearly the governance model as well as the business model. So these different models are the models of how your family functions, whether it's culturally, whether it's environmentally, like what type of environment you live in, and also the culture of the country that you live in, right? And ultimately, the performance of the organization. So as a unit, and all the people and the pieces that work within and are part of that unit, how ultimately they are performing, as in, are they succeeding in life or are they lost in terms of direction as to where they're going? This is how the principle of transparency applies to how we can help this family unit progress and grow and become a much better version contributing to society. Okay? So one of the first things about transparency is clarity. Clarity, I find, is one of those challenging components in our day-to-day lives, because a lot of times there is a lot of unclear information, unclear expectations, unclear models of engagement that exist among us, because the lack of clarity sometimes makes it advantageous for businesses and for the different systems around us to be able to influence us. And so I always like to remind myself of something that Dr. Brene Brown said. And she says, clear is kind. When you are being clear, you are being kind. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's a very simple philosophy. But if you sit down and really ponder this one simple sentence, being clear is being kind, you'll realize that clarity is one of those very rare things that we have in life. But when we do have it, and when things are very clear, we will tend to be able to maneuver through the challenging times. We will tend to be better equipped to deal with all the different obstacles that could pop up in our lives. And we will then have a better sense of direction as to where we're going. And that ties into expectations and agreements, right? If we have clear expectations and agreements that are set right from the get-go, whether it's between parents and children, or it's between partners, or it's between siblings, right? These are all components of day-to-day life that can very, very easily influence our mood, how we deal with people around us, and also how we move on to the next step and then the near future as to how we then incorporate other people into our lives. So clear expectations, setting those expectations are the fundamentals of dictating where we're going, why we're doing this, and how long we're going to set the time frame so that we can get there, right? Ultimately. Now, one of the things that I really do appreciate about being in the Asian culture is, I gotta tell you, parents will have very clear expectations. And the expectations are very simple. Growing up, you're practically expected to become a professional when you grow up. Like, that's just how Asian parents think. Now, there's probably 1% of Asian parents that, will give you the freedom of choosing whatever it is that you love. But that's a very, very small minority because I can tell you 99% of people who have grown up, whether in Asia or in the Western world, our parents have ingrained in us the expectation that we are either going to become a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, or some other type of professional. And that's just how the culture works. That's how they were brought up. Our parents were brought up this way. And so they passed that same type of thinking on to us. But the key is that these are clear expectations. Now, whether you meet those expectations or not, that's up to you. But I do know that from, I guess, my generation, and all the people that I have known, I'd say 90% of most of my friends and colleagues of mine have all grown up with that same expectation. So there's definitely plenty of good that comes out of those expectations, but there are obviously some drawbacks, right? And so the clear expectation side of things is that as children and adolescent years kind of creep up on you, you're going to be influenced and distracted by everything that's surrounding you. But because we've had the expectations that our parents have set right from the get-go, I feel that as I'm looking at all my friends who have become professionals, we're all fairly, I think, successful in our respective areas. Are we happy? I can't say that because that's something that, needs to be qualitated by, an individual, on a very individual basis. Um, but I think we have our basic needs met. I can definitely say that. Um, so the good that comes out of it is it gives you that solid structure of what is the basis of the expectation. And it gives you a clear indication of where you should be going, right? Whether you make it there, that's another, story for another time. But it at least sets you up for like that minimal standard. And if that minimal standard is met, at least you'll have your basic, levels met. And then what you do with the next few levels, that's all up to you, right? So I am taking it from that perspective of, you know, Asian parents are very transparent with their kids. We have these expectations and we expect these things from you. But on the flip side is most Asian kids, we generally live with our parents for, gosh, well into our 20s, and we're not expected to pay for the basic needs. So, for example, most Asian parents, again, there are some exceptions to the rule, but I'm just speaking to the general. Most Asian parents will provide a roof over our heads, meals, a little bit of, extra spending money while we're going to school, meeting the expectations that they have set out for us. So there is a little bit of the agreements, right, side of things, is that because we're expected to reach this standard that you have set for us, we have agreed that you will provide for us this basic level of cost of living that is going to be covered by, our parents, right? So there is a little bit of an exchange there. But that's where clear expectations and agreements come into play in a mutually beneficial situation. So I just wanted to take it from that angle because sometimes, structure can feel really confined, and I'm not saying that it's not difficult growing up in an Asian family because it surely is. But having the clear expectations and agreements really does, I think, benefit both parties in the end, right? Like we can definitely see how there's going to be a certain level of standard that we can meet. And I think that's actually a good thing, especially when living in a sort of growing up in a Western sort of culture and environment can quite often distract us and become a little bit you know confusing sometimes, because the expectations and agreements are very different in different cultures. And so when you have been ingrained and the seed has been planted so deeply in you that you already know that these are your expectations and you are going to meet them, then it really helps you stay true to that structure and it provides some sense of comfort. I know it's crazy, but it's true. It does provide you that safety net that you feel like, okay, well, I know that once I meet these expectations and, I do this, then, eventually I'll be able to make my own choice as to what I want to do with that later on, right? And so I think that in itself is very important because ultimately, right, we were talking about ultimately the performance of the organization, which is how the life of that child turns out. They'll have at least their basic needs met and they won't have to go on social assistance or, different types of programs. So you'll be self-sustaining at some point in time, which I think is sort of the expectation of the Asian parent. Like they have high hopes and really want their children to be able to provide for themselves and become self, independent of of in their lives, right? So being clear is kind, and having clear expectations and agreements is very important as well when we're talking about using the principle of transparency to help us. And the third part is the model, right? The model aspect, and I like to look at it from the perspective of congruence. How many people do we know growing up who you've met who will say something but do something else? So a little bit of that double standard. They'll say, oh, so and so, so and so is not doing great in school, so therefore we should just let them be, right? Where, Whereas, okay, let's take it back to our Asian culture again. Most Asian parents are very competitive, right? So generally it's like, oh, so what's your kid doing after school? And I'd say 99% of Asian parents are like, oh, well, I put them in this class, abacus, math tutoring, English tutoring, like a whole slew of, like, their schedule's packed after school. And then you get this other group of parents, kind of like me, who we don't really schedule our kids, So we got two ends of the spectrum where they don't really, schedule anything for their kids that is academically enhancing, right? So my kids don't go to math class or English class or um, but instead, I do choose the more artsy types of things, So both my children will either go to an art studio, they'll learn how to play Go.